In 1943, the most feared aircraft in the American arsenal wasn't a sleek German Messerschmitt or a heavily armed Japanese Zero. It was one of our own. The American Martin B-26 Marauder, a fast, powerful twin-engine medium bomber, killed so many of its own pilots in training accidents that bases considered transferring it a relief, and airmen grimly bestowed upon it the sinister nickname, the Widowmaker. It was a mechanical pariah, a high-stakes gamble in the sky that demanded absolute perfection, and it was quickly draining America's precious supply of trained male pilots. The crisis became so severe that the Army Air Forces, in a truly desperate and revolutionary move, turned to the last people anyone expected to tame this beast: women. The two people the Army chose to prove the Widowmaker could be flown safely, the two women whose professional reputation and personal rivalry rested entirely on this dangerous aircraft, were themselves locked in a bitter, behind-the-scenes conflict that few knew about. This is the untold story of Jacqueline Cochran, the ambitious, politically connected celebrity aviator and cosmetics mogul who craved command and recognition, and Nancy Harkness Love, the quiet, aristocratic leader of the elite, experienced pilots who prioritized service over fame. They were two of the greatest pilots in America, each having achieved aviation milestones that men only dreamed of, and now they were locked in a personal and professional battle to control the fate of the Women Airforce Service Pilots, or WASP. Their personal war, fought not in the skies over Germany, but in the bureaucratic halls of the Pentagon and in the unforgiving cockpits of America's most lethal aircraft, would determine if women had any legitimate, lasting place in the skies of World War II, or if they would be dismissed as a temporary curiosity. We will uncover the recently declassified records and forgotten personal diaries to reveal how these two women, with radically different visions, conquered America's most dangerous bomber, why their intense rivalry almost destroyed the entire WASP program from within, and how their secret conflict and their ultimate sacrifice were ultimately covered up and erased from public history by the Army Air Forces. The world before 1942 was a world that, for the most part, refused to imagine a woman in the cockpit of a military machine. The prevailing sentiment was that women were too emotional, too physically fragile, and lacked the necessary mechanical intuition to handle the rigors of modern high-speed flight. Yet, by late 1941, reality was quickly tearing apart these deeply held societal assumptions. The attack on Pearl Harbor immediately transformed the United States from a nation preparing for war to a nation fighting for its life, and the subsequent mobilization effort was unprecedented and overwhelming. President Roosevelt called for the production of 50,000 aircraft a year, a staggering demand that created a colossal and immediate problem. Who was going to fly them? Every available male pilot was needed for combat training or deployment overseas to the European or Pacific theaters, creating a vast vacuum of personnel on the home front. Factory floors, like the massive Willow Run plant that churned out B-24 Liberators, were producing planes faster than the military could move them. The logistical crisis was staggering. Thousands of brand-new, multi-million-dollar aircraft sat stranded on factory ramps or domestic airfields, waiting for pilots to ferry them to bases, modify them for combat, or deliver them to shipping ports. Archival footage from the time shows seemingly endless lines of newly built warplanes, waiting for the one essential component America could no longer spare: a man to fly them. America's arsenal was expanding, but its ability to move that arsenal was contracting, threatening to choke the entire war effort. The solution needed was radical, But the military institution was inherently conservative and resistant to change, leading the Air Force leadership, particularly General Henry Hap Arnold, to reluctantly admit that if they wanted to move the war machine forward, they would need to look beyond the gender lines they had so strictly drawn. The desperate shortage had created a historic and narrow window of opportunity, but it was a window that only the most skilled and tenacious women would be able to fly through. And two women in particular were ready to seize the moment, though their paths would immediately diverge. This desperate need for ferry pilots served as the inciting incident for the entire saga, but it immediately fractured the effort into two competing visions. First came the proposal from Nancy Harkness Love, an aviator with immense experience and a quiet, aristocratic demeanor. Love had logged thousands of hours flying professionally, including cross-country racing and commercial work, and she understood the military's current, conservative mindset. Her plan was pragmatic and modest. Create a small, elite corps of the best qualified female pilots in the country, pilots who already possessed commercial licenses and had logged over 500 hours of flight time. This Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, or WAFS, would be a quick, efficient solution to the immediate ferrying crisis, integrating a few dozen top-tier pilots into the existing Air Transport Command, ATC. Love's vision was cautious, focusing on demonstrable competence and minimizing controversy. She simply wanted to fill a gap with highly proven professionals. Her approach was less about revolution and more about immediate, discrete utility. However, almost simultaneously, the far more ambitious and politically charged proposal of Jacqueline Cochran emerged. Cochran was a self-made celebrity, a beauty executive who grew up in poverty and clawed her way to global fame, winning the Bendix Air Race and setting numerous records. She was a political powerhouse, a close friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and General Arnold himself. Cochran's vision was not a modest corps of a few dozen experienced flyers, but a massive training program designed to turn hundreds and eventually over 1,000 ordinary women into military-style pilots through rigorous instruction. She saw the war as a chance to create a permanent, militarized women's air corps, not just a temporary stopgap. She wanted to train women from scratch, teaching them the standardized military way from day one. This was the radical, high-risk, high-reward idea that promised to solve the pilot shortage long-term, but it was a threat to the established order and a direct challenge to Love's smaller, more manageable plan. The Army, unable or unwilling to fully commit to one vision, authorized both, setting the stage for an immediate organizational friction between the experienced WAFS and the newly minted, trained from the ground up WASP trainees. This radical push immediately hit a wall of deep-seated institutional resistance and societal skepticism. General Henry Hap Arnold, the powerful head of the Army Air Forces, was initially a reluctant supporter at best, viewing the entire endeavor as a potentially embarrassing experiment that he secretly hoped would fail so he could focus on the real war effort. He harbored serious concerns about the safety and reliability of women piloting complex military aircraft, echoing the prevailing sentiments of the time that women might panic under stress or lack the physical strength for heavy controls. Quotes from politicians and military leaders of the era reveal the depth of this prejudice. Critics frequently dismissed the idea as a frivolous distraction, warning that it would damage military morale and lower the professional standards of the Air Force. Newspaper editorials often focused on the novelty of girls in uniform rather than their actual competence, undercutting the seriousness of their service. The opposition was not just institutional, but economic too. Powerful civilian male pilot unions feared that if women proved they could fly military aircraft, They would return after the war to steal valuable civilian jobs. This lobbying effort would become a massive political weight, pressing down on the WASP program. The women, regardless of whether they were in Love's WFS or Cochran's eventual WASP training classes, faced constant, grueling scrutiny from male instructors and base commanders, who were often openly hostile, expecting them to wash out. They were housed in inadequate barracks, provided substandard equipment, and had to shoulder all the risks of military flying without the protection, pay, or benefits of military status. Every mistake was amplified, every success downplayed, because the protagonists, Cochran, Love, and every woman under their command, were fundamentally fighting not just the war in the air, but the war against their own country's deeply embedded prejudice. This intense scrutiny and antagonism made their eventual triumphs over aircraft like the Widowmaker not just acts of skill, but acts of profound political defiance. The conflict built immediately upon the creation of the two separate programs, fostering an environment where a simple difference in approach blossomed into bitter organizational rivalry. Nancy Love's WAFS were activated first in late 1942, immediately taking on the critical task of ferrying planes from factory to base. These women were already seasoned professionals, proud of their elite status and their ability to immediately contribute. Jacqueline Cochran's program, initially called the Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFTD, was established shortly after, and focused on training women with much less flight time, or even none at all. When the two programs were merged in 1943 to form the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the internal friction did not vanish. It simply intensified, with Love serving as the head of the ferrying division and Cochran as the director of all women pilots. The rivalry was immediately apparent in their management styles. Cochran, the charismatic autocrat, insisted on rigorous, often overly strict, military discipline at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, the primary training base. Her goal was to professionalize the women to the point where their military status could not be denied. Conversely, Love's group prized experience and mission success, viewing the overly rigid training regimen at Avenger Field as an unnecessary theatrical flourish. Personal accounts from WASP diaries reveal the duality of the program. One group enduring the brutal dust storms and inadequate facilities of the training base, constantly pushing themselves past the breaking point, while the other was already flying critical missions, sometimes feeling superior to the students from Texas. This internal divide, fueled by the ego and conflicting political strategies of Cochran and Love, created two competing cultures within the same uniform, constantly forcing the women to navigate a political minefield in addition to the inherent dangers of flying. Their personal Cold War, Cochran maneuvering politically in Washington, Love leading by example on the flight lines, meant that the WASP program was always fighting a two-front war. One against the skepticism of the military, and one against itself. The true moment of triumph and the turning point that irrevocably proved the worth of the WASP program came in the form of the twin-engine American B-26 Marauder, the Widowmaker. This was the ultimate challenge, a machine so feared that many male pilots refused to fly it. Its danger stemmed from a critical design choice. Its short, sleek wings gave it incredible speed, making it the fastest medium bomber in the world. But this also meant it had an unforgivingly high landing speed. The margin for error was almost non-existent. If a pilot approached too slowly, the plane would drop like a stone, and if they lost an engine on takeoff, they had less than a second to react before the wing dipped, cartwheeled, and exploded. The Air Force had an inventory of B-26s, and they needed experienced pilots to safely ferry them from the factory to the warfronts. But the terrible crash statistics of male training commands made assigning pilots a politically volatile proposition. It was in this moment of crisis that the WASP were strategically assigned to the B-26 program. The military's logic was perverse. If the women could fly it safely, it would prove the B-26 was inherently safe and not a design flaw, thus relieving pressure on the aircraft's manufacturer and the military command. It was a massive political and professional gamble. The women approached the dangerous aircraft with a mix of fear and professional resolve. First-hand accounts describe the B-26 cockpit as a place where you either learned perfection or you died. Pilots like Betty Hyler Gillis and Dora Docherty Struther were among the first to successfully master the B-26, and they did it by adhering to the manual with a fastidious precision that many of the more cavalier male pilots lacked. The WASP, knowing their entire program was under scrutiny, flew the B-26 by the book, meticulously checking every detail, and rapidly achieved a superior safety record compared to their male counterparts in training units. This was the silent, devastating proof of their competency. By conquering the Widowmaker, the WASP did more than ferry a plane. They completely silenced one of the most persistent arguments against female pilots, proving in the most dramatic way possible that they possessed the discipline, strength, and skill to master the most unforgiving machine in the American arsenal. It was the crowning achievement of the entire WASP experiment, marking the point where their success became undeniable. The success of the WASP program was ultimately documented not just in the conquered cockpits, but in the hard, undeniable statistical proof they generated over the course of the war. This evidence became the ultimate weapon against the prejudice they faced. By the time the program was disbanded, the numbers were staggering and irrefutable, presenting an overwhelming case for their professional competence. Over 1,000 women completed the training and flew a collective total of more than 60 million miles across the continental United States. They ferried an astonishing 12,650 aircraft of 78 different types, representing virtually every aircraft in the Army's inventory, from the tiny L-4 Grasshoppers to the massive B-29 Superfortress. WASP pilots were the first women to fly jets for the American military, serving as test pilots for experimental and prototype aircraft, towing targets for live fire training, a task male pilots despised and often deemed suicide, and even simulating combat missions. They towed targets for 50,000 hours, allowing thousands of male gunners to hone their skills before heading overseas. Crucially, in direct refutation of the claims that women were too fragile or unreliable, the accident rate of the WASP ferrying command was found to be lower than that of male pilots in the training command during the same period. They lost 38 women in service, fatalities that occurred without the benefits of military status and who were often sent home at family expense. But their overall safety record under intense pressure was exemplary. These facts and figures, displayed in internal Army Air Forces reports, became the professional shield the women wielded, demonstrating with cold, hard logic that their contribution was not a novelty, but a strategic necessity and a professional success. They proved that competence knows no gender, a statistical victory that no amount of political skepticism could erase. To truly understand the cost of this statistical proof, one must look beyond the numbers and into the personal story of the women who flew. Consider Cornelia Fort, a talented civilian instructor pilot who had the chilling distinction of being one of the first American pilots to encounter the Japanese attack force near Pearl Harbor while flying a civilian training flight. She was one of the first women Nancy Love recruited into the WAFS, bringing her prestige and high skill to the ferrying squadron. Fort's service, however, came to a tragic end while ferrying a BT-13 basic trainer, when she was involved in a mid-air collision with a male pilot who failed to see her aircraft. She died on March 21, 1943, becoming the first female pilot to die on active duty for the American military. Her death underscored the profound danger and the absolute commitment of the women. She was flying for the military, died in the line of duty, yet her body had to be accompanied home by a civilian escort. And the flag that draped her coffin was, officially, only a civilian one. The personal stories echoed this deep sense of injustice. WASP pilots, often in their early 20s, wrote letters home describing the constant exhaustion, the poorly maintained aircraft, and the casual cruelty of some male instructors who were determined to make them fail. One pilot described flying a difficult multi-day cross-country ferry mission alone, battling intense weather and mechanical failure, only to arrive at her destination and be told by the base commander that women had no business flying military aircraft. Yet, for every moment of condescension, there was a profound sense of sisterhood and purpose. These women knew they were making history, pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and proving their capabilities not just to the military, but to themselves. These personal sacrifices, particularly the 38 lives lost, reveal the human toll behind the statistical achievement and solidify the enduring, emotional legacy of the program. The success of the WASP program led directly to the political battle for its very survival, a climax that ended in shocking betrayal. By early 1944, the WASP had performed so admirably that General Arnold, formerly their biggest skeptic, was now their most ardent supporter. He lobbied aggressively for the passage of a bill that would grant the women full military status, providing them with the respect, pay, and critical veterans benefits they had earned. The mood was one of celebratory confidence. The women had served their time, proven their skill on the most lethal aircraft, and it seemed a foregone conclusion that Congress would grant them what was rightfully theirs. However, as the end of the war began to come into sight, powerful political forces moved behind the scenes. The civilian male pilots lobby, led by figures who saw the end of the war as a threat to their future employment, launched an aggressive, fear-mongering campaign against the bill. They argued that the WASP were no longer necessary, that they were a drain on the budget, and that trained male pilots would soon be returning from overseas, ready to take up the domestic ferrying roles. This was an outright political betrayal, a cold, calculated move to eliminate female competition for post-war jobs. The political fight became intensely toxic, with opponents leveling accusations that questioned the women's integrity and even their morality. In a shocking move fueled by a combination of job protectionism and entrenched sexism, the House of Representatives voted against militarization in June 1944. The bill was defeated, and the immediate consequence was devastating. The entire WASP program was abruptly disbanded in December 1944. The women were dismissed unceremoniously, given a bus ticket home, and no official recognition, leaving the hundreds of female pilots who had risked their lives to tame the Widowmaker and ferry the nation's air power to feel heartbroken and profoundly betrayed, their service erased by the very country they had saved. The shocking disbandment of the WASP program in 1944, followed by the immediate classification and sealing of all their official records, effectively erased them from history for over 3 decades. The Army Air Forces, in a move of profound historical negligence, covered up the story of their success, allowing the nation to forget the vital role these women played in the war effort. This classification was the ultimate injustice, denying the WASP any chance of the recognition, pay, and veterans' medical benefits they desperately needed. It wasn't until the mid-1970s that a new political battle began, driven by the WASP veterans themselves, who were now middle-aged and fighting for their place in history. Led by women like Elizabeth Strophus, and supported by powerful allies, including Senator Barry Goldwater, a former World War II pilot who knew firsthand the value of their service, the fight to gain military status began anew. Finally, in 1977, Congress passed a bill granting the WASP official military veteran status, a recognition that came 33 years late, but was nonetheless a profound moral victory. This long-fought campaign ensured that their sacrifice was finally honored. The true legacy, however, extends far beyond their veteran status. The performance of the WASP, their mastery of the B-26, and their statistically proven competence directly dismantled the myth that women could not handle high-performance aircraft. Their service created the critical, undeniable precedent that finally paved the way for women to enter the modern U.S. Air Force and Navy as pilots decades later, transitioning from ferrying planes to flying them in combat zones. The pioneering work of Love, Cochran, and the 1,000 women they led cracked the glass ceiling of the cockpit, ensuring that the skies would never again be exclusively a man's domain. The story of the Women Airforce Service Pilots is more than just a footnote in aviation history. It is powerful proof that some of America's most decisive battles in World War II were fought not against foreign enemies, but against deeply entrenched prejudice and resistance at home. The intense conflict in the cockpit between Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love, fueled by their drastically different approaches to achieving the same goal, was a high-stakes, behind-the-scenes drama that drove the women to achieve incredible feats, culminating in their triumph over the deadly B-26 Marauder. Yet, it was the political war that followed, the betrayal that grounded them, that truly reveals the complex and often hidden struggles that define the American war effort. Their success was undeniable, their professionalism profound, and their ultimate sacrifice for recognition echoes through the decades. If you believe these forgotten stories, stories of revolutionary achievement against institutional resistance, deserve to be uncovered and told, then I urge you to support the channel by subscribing, hitting the notification bell, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what other hidden history, what other doctrine or conflict you think we should dive into next.